Listen to this clip. Did you hear it? Did you hear that bang? I'll play it again. What you heard there was a catastrophic failure on the 57 Chev. There, that's it. Beautiful. Thank you. G'day Jaffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. So if you haven't guessed already, I've got a hole in the sump because I hit that little bollard at the front door of my shed. So this car has no engine oil in it at the moment. So I'm jacking it up so I can get under there, have a look at where the hole is, put a little bit of Silastic or something in the hole, let that dry, fill the sump up with oil so that I can drive it 2 bays over and get it up on the hoist and repair it properly. Unbelievable, hey? Unbelievable. Get a couple of jack stands under here for safety, of course. Wee bit of carby cleaner, and I can see the hole already. Right there in the corner. Look at that. How is that for bad luck? It's whacked right on that corner and just peeled the weld on that very, very corner of the sump. Okay, I'm gonna get some gasket goo that up, let it dry so I can fill the sump and drive over to my bay that has the hoist in it. All right, that's bodged up enough to allow me to get over 2 bays to my hoist. I'll let that flash off for 24 hours, fill her up with oil and move her over. I'm now putting some engine oil in the motor so that I could drive it over to my hoist bay and deal with the issue properly. And that's going to mean pulling the sump off and welding it. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to handle that one yet, but anyway, stick around and we'll work it out together. Well, I don't have oil pissing out all over the floor, so my temporary Silastic job is holding. Let's move this car over before it changes its mind and decides to spew out its guts. Okay, let's get this sucker up in the air. Check out that repair, man. Hey, it's friggin' awesome. I might just leave that. No, I'm kidding. I won't just leave it. Oh boy, oh boy. So to get this sump out of here, obviously got to drain it, pull all the bolts off. Looks like the starter motor's got to come out because I can't get to some of those bolts. And maybe the steering cross member. Oh joy, oh bliss. Sump plug popped. I already cracked that earlier. Now I got to pull all the steering linkage out of the road because the sump will not be able to drop when that's in the way. Okay, pull this cover off the back of the transmission because that's going to interfere with the back bolts in the sump. Okay, starter's off. Now the turbo drain lines have got to come off. All right, that one's off. Now I got a second one on the other side. Turbo drain lines are off. Now I got to get all these 5/16 bolts off that are holding the pan on. And then there's 4 big ones in the 4 corners. Well, I've had this fan blowing in the inside of this sump all night because what I tried to do is drive out all those petrol fumes before I hit this with a welder. I have had a bad experience with blowing something up when I was welding, and that was a fuel tank. And I thought I had cleaned it out and got all the fumes out of it, but the emergency department in the hospital begged to differ. Now, rather than cutting that little bit of metal off there, I'm actually going to keep that. Knock that back into shape and then use my welder to fill that all in. Now I've got my welder turned right down because I suspect this stuff is going to be thin as anything. Well, I didn't ignite, so that's a good start. Now I'll fill that corner with a bit of brake cleaner and see whether I've got a leak, because that brake cleaner is super permeable stuff. So if there's a leak, yeah, it'll show it. It looks excellent. No leakage. All right, we got her fixed. Nice one. Next step, I'm going to go along and knock all of these flat, because sometimes on these tin oil pans, these bolt holes here actually deform when you tighten the bolts up. You got to be really gentle because they're just small little bolts, but I don't know, the bloody pan gives a lot quicker than what you think it will. And to do that flattening, I've just got a hammer and dolly, just as long as I can get the dolly in there. All right, I'll test fit my gasket. I use these one-piece sump gaskets, and I absolutely swear by them. The old ones were 2 cork runners on either side, and then you had the rubber on either ends. So they had a tendency to leak in the corners, and of course the cork eventually starts to bleed oil as well. The other thing I like about these is they've got these little steel inserts, so you can't actually tighten it down too tight because these steel inserts will bottom out, which is pretty cool, because with the old cork jobos, you can tighten those bolts down too tight and the cork gasket just squeezes out. The only modification I make to these is I cut that little bit out there. There's nothing there on the inside of the sump, so it just basically seals along there. But if you don't cut that out, sometimes I've found your dipstick will foul against that and you'll have difficulty pushing it in and out. So just by chopping that out of there, you don't get any foulage. Okay, I got the gasket all cleaned off on the bottom side of the motor, paying particular attention to the back and the front of the sump where these things are always prone to leak. While I was in here, I checked the big end float on the crank journal and I checked the crank float on the thrush washer, and both of those were spot on. Here's a cool little invention. They come with a one-piece sump gasket. You can basically clip your sump up in there, and this little plastic thing holds the sump in place while you get the bolts ready. Pretty cool. And then you can just screw it out, obviously. Somebody was thinking. Now it's time to glue this sucker up. And what I'm gonna do is glue the pan, then place the gasket on the pan, and then glue the top side of the gasket, and then go over to the engine block and just do a little bit more glue on those couple of leak areas, being these corners, and then lift the whole thing up into place. Got a lot of air in that tube. Mr. Permatex, I feel as though I'm getting ripped off. Okie dokie, gasket time. Okay, that's seated down on there nicely. These are the corners that leak. Here, 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 and here. Now, I'm certain the camera's not going to pick this, but that's okay. You got an idea what I'm talking about. It's up in these corners, right in front of the rear main seal and the timing cover seal up at the front of the motor. All right, sump is ready to be brought up in place. Wish me luck. I think we got it. Okay, now I'll screw all these little 5/16 nuts down. Alrighty folks, nothing to see here. I'll continue working. All right, probably worthy of an update. I've got the sump all buttoned down. I got the 2 turbo drain hoses tied in, one there and one on that side of the sump, and they are not easy to get to. I can give you a hot tip there. Next step, I'll put on this transmission scatter shield or bash plate. That's located right there between the flywheel and the sump. Then I can bolt the starter back in place and this steering componentry back on. And just in case anybody forgot why I'm doing this, that was the reason. The hole in the sump. Unbelievable. Steering down. I like these with the little hex on them. Not so much for tightening them, but for taking the suckers off. It's awesome. All right, let's run through what we've done from the beginning. We've obviously welded our sump, new gasket, all the sump bolts are tight. The 2 drain valves for the turbo lines, they're done and tight. Starter motor bolted in place, transmission backing plate bolted in place, steering arms all bolted in place, including that big honking nut. Oil filter in place. The only thing left to do is throw some oil in her. No orange paint, so that'll have to stay bare steel for the time being. Probably for the best anyway, just to make sure that I've got no leaks there when I fill this thing up with oil, which is the next step. However, I'm not going to do that until tomorrow to allow that gasket material to set off completely. So we'll see you tomorrow. Okay, here we find ourselves back filling the car up with oil after I've done the repair to the sump. One thing of note with these older motors is I do not use synthetic oil. Synthetic oils have got really good lubricity. Lubricity? Is that a word? Anyway, they're very, very slippery. And actually what happens on these older motors is that oil can get past the gaskets. And on modern motors, there's not a lot of gaskets. They've got machine surfaces that are just bolted together. So for that reason, on these older motors, I use the good old mineral-based dyno oil. All right, go grab yourself a beer while I'm filling up the oil in this car and check back with me when she's filled up. Look at that, eh? No leaks. Okay, that's very encouraging. Time to drop her down off the hoist, fire her in the guts, and take her for a spin. Yeah, baby. All right, look at that oil pressure. Right up to about 60 pounds. Sweet. Got a bit of fuel, oil pressure's looking good at idle, charging is up above 13 volts. Haven't got any temperature in her yet because we haven't taken her for a spin. Let's go out for a ride.